The nonprofit National Popular Vote is pleased to be hosting today's conversation with Dr. John Hudak and Scott Drexel. National Popular Vote was founded in 2005 and advocates for the National Popular Vote Bill, which is a state-based plan that works to reform the Electoral College. When in effect, this bill will guarantee the presidency to the winner of the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC, making every vote equal under presidential elections. So far, this bill has been enacted by 16 jurisdictions with 196 electoral votes. John Hudak, PhD, is Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management and a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. His research examines questions of presidential power in the context of administration, personnel, and public policy. Additionally, he focuses on campaigns and elections, legislative-executive interaction, and state and federal marijuana policy. Today, we'll be discussing Mr. Hudak's 2014 book, Presidential Pork: White House Influence Over the Distribution of Federal Grants. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, John.
Thanks for having me.
Our second guest is Scott Drexel. Scott is a senior advisor to National Popular Vote, as well as an advisor to some of the country's most active Democratic campaigns. He has worked in over 30 states on behalf of National Popular Vote. Thanks for joining us, Scott.
Thank you.
I'll be moderating this conversation today. I'm Eileen Reavey, and I serve as the National Grassroots Director for National Popular Vote. For those of you that are tuning in via Zoom, you are able to submit questions at any time throughout the panel. Please submit them using the Q&A feature that you'll see on your screen. And of course, if you want to have a conversation with other members, please reserve that for the chat function. We've reserved the last portion of this webinar for questions from the audience, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature at any time throughout the discussion. This webinar is being shared live on Facebook and will be available afterwards both on Facebook and National Popular Vote's YouTube channel. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. So, John, the research that you undertook is really unique. So you took two accepted facts in the world of politics: that presidents are powerful players in domestic policy affairs, and that elected officials are motivated by elections. And you piece them together in a new way. And prior to your research, no one had really paired these two things together. So can you just start off by telling us what led you to this particular strain of research?
Yeah, thanks, Eileen, for that question. You're right. Prior to my work, there were sort of two separate towers in political science talking about the presidency and talking about elections. One, as you noted, is that presidents engage in domestic affairs in significant ways, and they have their hands in a lot. And they have their hands in a lot both directly and through the more than 4,000 political appointees that a president can select upon entering office. The other tower is that, for the most part, elected officials are driven by re-election. We know that's true of governors, we know that's true of state legislators, and of course, the foundation for that, we know that's true for members of Congress. And that extends generally to the international context as well, particularly in systems that look like the American model. But overlapping those, to say that presidents are re-election-minded individuals really wasn't part of the broader conversation, at least not in a rigorous way. We knew that presidents wanted to be re-elected, but what we didn't appreciate as a discipline is that they use the powers of domestic policy, particularly spending policy, to achieve that. We know that members of Congress do that. We know legislators in a variety of contexts use pork barrel politics, but it really that application hadn't happened for presidents. Now, for me, writing my dissertation in graduate school, I was really hoping that that was true of presidents, because if it wasn't, I was gonna have to start over with a dissertation or more likely leave graduate school. But luckily, in a bipartisan way, Democrats and Republicans, and over a period of time, I found that that's exactly right. Presidents, in a lot of ways, act just like members of Congress. They steer money to key electoral constituencies at key times.
So specifically within your research, you looked at federal discretionary grant allocations from a time frame of 1996 to 2008. And just for our audience, discretionary grants mean grants that are not mandatory automated spending like Social Security or Medicare. And you assessed whether presidents direct funds to key electoral constituencies, as you've said. So can you tell us a little bit more about one of the hypotheses in your book, that the swing states receive more in grants than the lost cause states, as you phrased it?
So it's sort of a truism in presidential politics that presidents are interested in swing states. And while swing states change from election to election, though not really from one to another, but if we look back at, say, 1992, for instance, Connecticut was a swing state. We don't really think of Connecticut as a swing state anymore. It's a solid Democratic state. Other states that were previously solid in one direction or another may now be swing states. And so we know that that drives presidents. We know that campaign visits, campaign spending, staff, get out the vote efforts for presidents of both parties are really focused in the handful of states that are competitive. I define competitive as decided by 10 points or less in the previous presidential election, and I think there's a conversation that can be had about whether that's the best reflection of competitiveness, particularly in a year like this one, where there may be an enormous number of states decided by 10 percentage points or fewer. But ultimately, we know presidents are focused there. And so if you take the sort of congressional model of pork barrel politics and apply it to presidents, their constituency, their key constituency, in a sense, their home constituency, are those swing states. And so we should expect that they're going to target those funds, any funds that they can manipulate in a discretionary way toward those swing states at the expense of not only the states that they're essentially guaranteed to lose, like President Trump is guaranteed to lose New York and Connecticut, or the ones that he's guaranteed to win, like Alabama or Mississippi that President Trump is guaranteed to win in November. Those states are not as important to a president. Again, in terms of campaign stops, campaign spending, staffing, it's also not important to the president as much in terms of pork barrel politics.
And when we're talking about this isn't a matter of, oh, these swing states got maybe 0.5% more of federal grant dollars. They're really large numbers, right? So reference from your book, swing states receive between 7.3% and 7.6% more grants than other states. And they see 5.7% more grant dollars than other states. And can you just talk about some of the implications for what that really means for states, the kind of things that they could do with those millions of dollars?
Sure. To put it into context, in an average size state, so an average size state is Tennessee, for instance. A state the size of Tennessee, to get 5.5% to 6% more grant dollars, you're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars range. And so it's a meaningful amount of money for a state in a given year. And again, this isn't over the course of a president's term. This is per year that this is happening. And it ramps up right before an election year as well. And so states can do a lot with that money. Federal discretionary funds are delivered to a variety of types of needs throughout within a state: education, transportation, housing, healthcare, a variety of things. Now, granted, there are also non-discretionary funds that target those columns as well, but we're talking billions of dollars every year overall, and so it's quite a bit of money. What I think is also important to note at the outset is I think one of the concerns, and it's a concern I've heard in Q&A sessions talking about my book since I wrote it, was that, well, is this corruptive, right? And I think people could look at this behavior and see it as corruptive. What I will say, though, is at the state level, there is tremendous need, and that need goes unmet. And so it's not as if this funding is flowing to a given state, and it's going to projects that are not in need of funding, projects that are, nonsensical or fall into the category of waste, fraud, and abuse. These are people who applied for funds, and maybe there are recipients in other states that deserve them more, but certainly these are individuals and groups and organizations and local governments that also deserve these funds, that also are in need of these funds. And so again, it's not corruption in the grand scheme that we might think of what could be done in this context. But what is happening is swing states are cashing in very lucrative ways because of these behaviors.
Yeah, that's an excellent point to make. So, Scott, practically speaking, these are numbers, that at National Popular Vote we cite when talking to state legislators. So when you're speaking with legislators, advocates, members of the party, of any party across the country, what's the reaction that you get from people about this kind of data?
I think probably the best effect that these numbers have is it removes some of the partisan lens from the equation. Certainly pre-2016, I think before there was a little bit more partisan anxiety around who benefits, less of a knee-jerk assumption necessarily that you would have Democrats doing better in the popular vote every time, and the Electoral College really representing sort of a safety net under the winner-take-all system for Republicans. I think one way that we've been able to sort of cut through some of the partisan noise has been by saying, look, there is a clear disparity between what your state gets as a battleground or as a non-battleground state versus what this state right next door gets. I remember at one point when we were in New York working on National Popular Vote there, the Senate was under Republican control, the Assembly was under Democratic control. And at one point during the Hurricane Sandy efforts, relief efforts, there were senators who were filibustering aid packages demanding federal offsets to pump standing water out of lower Manhattan. And we were able to sort of say to the legislators, there's no chance this would be happening in a state like Florida. No one would demand federal offsets. And it sort of turned into kind of a light bulb moment for people where they said it really does pay to be a battleground state. And if we're never going to be one, or if we're going to be one and then not be one again for 40 years, this is really an unsafe system for us. I think the other thing that tends to be helpful is every state has some very clear example. Every state that's not a battleground state where they can look at the disparity between some regionally significant issue and the way they're treated under it compared to a more competitive neighbor. Everything from dredging issues between Georgia and Florida, or transportation issues between battleground states, non-battleground states all over the country. So I think it's been helpful for us, and particularly with Dr. Hudak's book, to look at all of the different examples that he cites and say really concretely, you suffered here because you had just a few too many Democrats or just a few too many Republicans to make you electorally relevant. And I think particularly when you start getting into disaster funding, that's where it really starts making sense for legislators, because now you're talking about which fires are you putting out based on who is electorally relevant, or what sick people are going to be treated based on who is electorally relevant, and how perverse that type of conversation really is. So I think it might be a little esoteric for your average voter, but certainly where legislators who go to state capitals during their sessions thinking about how do I deliver on my promises of making sure that we have adequate funding for transportation, of making sure that we're getting our fair share of tax dollars from the federal government, to show them that this system is actively working against what they're trying to do every day. Again, it really cuts through that partisan noise.
Scott, if I could jump in, it's such a great point about disaster funding in particular. Federal funding is politicized from a policy perspective as well. There are types of programs that Democrats think a lot of funding should be directed towards, Republicans think less. Funding that Republicans think a lot of funding should go towards and Democrats think less. But disaster funding tends to be bipartisan, particularly within the states that are hit by a disaster. It's those rare moments when you see entire state congressional delegations coming together regardless of party, asking for the same thing, speaking in one voice. And so it's really an ideal setting to have that conversation, whereas some other areas of funding may not go over as well depending on the letter after the person's name that you're talking to.
Absolutely.
And one of the other hypotheses in your book, and that's something that you touched on earlier, John, was that states receive more grants in the 2 years prior to an election than the 2 years following one. In fact, 10% more. And states receive about 6.6% more grant dollars when a presidential election is approaching when one is distant. And this is even true when a president is in their second term. So can you explain some of the factors that you looked at when coming to this conclusion?
Sure. So part of the reason you would expect that behavior to ramp up in advance of an election year comes from two sources, really. The first is just logic. You want this to be fresh in voters' minds. If there's a ribbon cutting ceremony at a bridge in your county 5 months after a presidential election, you might forget that 4 years later. But if it happens the month before the presidential election and the president's Secretary of Transportation is there for the ribbon cutting and he or she sends her best wishes from the president, that can get into the ether, and it certainly gets into media as well. The second is that we know that this happens in other contexts. So for instance, senators behave in different ways in their first 4 years in a term compared to their last 2 years in a term. It's harder for House members because House members are always running for re-election, so that's not as good of a metric. And so being able to apply that theory and that logic to the presidency also seems to be panning out. Another factor too that can be part of this is particularly in a president's first year in office. It does take some time to get a team in place, and while a president's interest in swing states is easily telegraphed throughout an administration and from administration to administration, getting your team in place, especially political appointees who are so critical to this process, that can also dilute what happens in the first year of a first term. That's less the case in the first year of a second term, although there is oftentimes quite a bit of exit in advance of that. And so that can have a little bit of an impact too.
I think also you can sort of, I think it becomes difficult in your first year to predict, or first 2 years of a presidential term, to predict with any kind of certainty what your battleground map is going to look like 4 years from that point. So I think if in 2009 you'd asked Barack Obama to make, or the Obama administration to make these kind of determinations, they might have taken states like Nevada and Colorado that were part and parcel to their path to victory in 2008, but weren't necessarily the types of nail-biter battlegrounds again 4 years later. So I think there's also a little bit of letting the dust settle from the previous election and understanding really where that's actually going to be valuable to direct your federal resources, in the last 2 years of your term. I know you don't get to write books for Brookings through anecdotal stories, but my wife's from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I've spent a lot of time there. At least during the peak of the state's battleground status in 2008 and 2012. You can't drive down the freeway without seeing more tractors parked on the side of the road and big signs that say your tax dollars hard at work. I mean, all that machinery is a giant billboard for the sitting administration. It is a reminder in the most palpable possible way that your federal government cares about you and wants you to feel that you have their interests at heart. So I think it's not just the actual dollars and where they go, but the show that's made of those dollars as they land in their respective targets.
Absolutely. John, as a part of your research, you did a lot of interviews with individuals that are directly engaged in the federal grant process and looked at the extent of presidential influence and the ways that the presidential preferences can affect even micro-level policy outcomes. So can you give us a broad overview of the power structures at play? Because we know it's so much more than, let's give Pennsylvania more money because we want to win. You gave some great examples in your book about the Great Lakes and mining as an example.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, it's clear to everyone within government, particularly people working in areas of funding and fund distribution, of what presidential preferences are. Now, some presidential preferences are over what we're talking about here, directing funds to swing states. There are, of course, policy-centered interests of presidents as well. So For President Bush, for instance, he had a real interest in distributing funds to faith-based organizations. That was a big part of his campaign. It was a big part of his 8 years in office. And so some of that faith-based funding may have been politicized towards swing states, but that was sort of a policy-oriented thing. And the president telegraphs that pretty easily, in the same way that a president telegraphs his interest in swing states simply by virtue of running a campaign. Political appointees know this. Staffers within agencies, career bureaucrats know this as well. And so for bureaucrats who are going through files and putting together lists of recommendations around funding or whatever process exists within an agency, they know all the way up the food chain what the expectations are. And so it's efficient for them to get it right on the first round rather than to have to go back and rework funding considerations because a mid-level appointee or a higher level appointee is not fully satisfied with what that funding distribution looks like. And so this gets institutionalized within federal agencies over a period of time. And talking with bureaucrats who worked on these issues, I was going into offices with this area of research that was very new to political science. In all honesty, there were people who doubted that presidents even cared or behaved in this way. And I would talk to bureaucrats who would laugh in my face, not because it was a dumb idea, but because it was so obviously true to them that this happened. And that was, I guess the only time you like to get laughed in your face in a meeting is when people are like telling you your hypotheses are going to work here. It's going to work out okay. And that was happening on a regular basis, talking to interest groups who rely on federal funding. It's the same situation where there was it was a duh moment for them. It was an of course moment for them that this happens. And they work within that structure because they have to work within that structure. And like I said, it's institutionalized, it's passed down from sort of bureaucratic generation and interest group generation to the next. That this is how the system works. The system works in that way because of the way that the federal electoral system is structured, and it's going to continue that way until there's a change in that.
Yeah, and I really liked the example that you gave of talking to a national interest group where they were seeking funding and were specifically told to identify applicants in certain states, all of which happen to be swing states. And she'd been told to target those specifically as a way to just get ahead of, oh, we're going to filter these out anyway, which I think underlined your point that, yeah, these groups are all in need of funding, but there's this clear favoritism for the people that are working on this on the inside.
Yeah, and what people in that situation were saying was, I had more need elsewhere. But I had a lot of need in the states that were being targeted. And to my point earlier, it's not as if unworthy applicants were getting the funds. There's an enormous amount of need and there's worthy applicants everywhere. It's just a question of who would you give funding to before that other person? And I think that's the struggle that exists. But again, it's the system that these individuals have to operate in.
And can you elaborate a little bit on, just how this shakes out in terms of, okay, a president might have an environmental initiative and they have a lot of dollars that they need to spend on various programs, but they're able to pick an issue that's only relevant to a certain number of states. So on the surface, it looks like, oh yeah, we just really care about cleaning up abandoned mine sites, but really, the majority of those are in states that are really influential.
Yeah, when you think about EPA funding for Superfund sites or other types of repurposing funds for land, transitioning factories into new entities or whatever process you're going to use. When you think about the Rust Belt in the United States, to a lesser extent Minnesota, but a little bit of Minnesota, but Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These, with the exception, of course, of Illinois, which is a solid Democratic state, these are all swing states, and they've been swing states for quite some time. And so you can grab an issue like that where there will be a disproportionate impact in key states. Now, sure, you'll leave some swing states out of that. You might leave states like Florida out of that. And then money will go to other states like Illinois, for instance, or Indiana, that maybe don't fit into that mold. But these issues, these policies really can have an outsized impact in key states. Another is you can also pick policies that particularly help one state that you're focused on, and it might help other states. And so when you think about coastal funding, right, whether that is for coastal erosion programs, whether it's for renewable energy around wind, those things help Florida a lot. And it's not an accident in 2004 that President Bush, George W. Bush, was finding alternative energy grants, that there were a lot of programs in Florida. There were also alternative energy plants, or cleaner energy plants around the coal industry that helped Pennsylvania and Ohio. But the energy secretary at the time was making a lot of stops in a lot of key states, and they happened to be the states that pushed George W. Bush over the finish line in the Electoral College vote in 2000.
If you look at some of the states where national popular vote has passed, a lot of them happen to be in that Northeast corridor, where you're going from Washington, D.C. up into Delaware, Maryland, through what, at various points has been a bluer Pennsylvania than it has been in the last cycle or two. But up into New England, high-speed rail ended up being one of our best talking points, that particularly after President Obama was elected, there were huge grants made around high-speed rail funding. The places it makes sense to build high-speed rail most are places where you have cities in a linear pattern: Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and up the East Coast. The money did not go to the Northeast corridor. It went to Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida, where Governors Walker, Kasich, and Rick Scott all rejected the funding out of hand. And only after those governors didn't want the money did it go to places like California on the coast and into some of those Northeast corridor states at a far lower dollar amount than they were offered to their swing state communities. All of them had active requests for high-speed rail funding before the federal government, but their allocation was prioritized ahead of places that actually rely on commuter rail every single day.
So your overall conclusion that is, and I'll read this from actually the first chapter of your book, but through its state-centered winner-take-all design, the Electoral College creates incentives that make federal spending an appealing campaign tool for the executive branch. So I want to kind of pivot that to Scott. So that conclusion identifies state-based winner-take-all laws as the reason that we have presidents using their power to benefit these key constituencies. So how do you think that would look different under a system where the president would instead be chosen by national popular vote?
Sure. I mean, I think when there's nothing particularly magical about a vote in one state versus a vote in another state, it at least removes the incentive to prioritize one set of voters, regionally over another. I think that the real sin of this whole thing is that the system rewards it. From deciding whether to allocate money for wildfires in the West. You have a couple key states that have been battleground states in the past. I think removing even the appearance of an incentive to allocate wildfire funding in one state versus another because there might be an electoral reward for doing so is just an important step toward a better government that really should transcend politics. I think if you look at funding within individual states that's executive control, I think you'd probably find again that a governor of a medium-sized state has priorities throughout the state. And to Dr. Hudak's point earlier, if you have a tornado that hits a rural part of your state versus a tornado that hits a more populous part of your state, one might have a bigger price tag because it's affecting more property. But a problem is a problem is a problem, and you're going to approach any problem like that as though your electoral life depends on it, and as you can sort of remove that electoral lens from it and just view it as a human public policy challenge. So I think the biggest thing is I'm always very careful to not present national popular vote as though it's a panacea or a magic bullet that's going to fix every problem in national elections. But I think it really addresses a key problem, that there's a built-in incentive. And so I just think to the extent that the sitting presidents want to use the federal government to make their own reelection more likely, they'll have to find a different way to do it.
John?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Scott said. I think it's also important to pick up on something else that he said earlier. You were talking about New York as an example, where with Superstorm Sandy funding, New York was in a position where it probably would have fared better had it been a swing state. And I think, if the national popular vote system were in place, which I'm personally a huge fan of, if it were in place, I think it would not take politics out of federal funding. It would just redistribute the manner in which politics manifests. And for a state like New York, it's actually quite meaningful. So I think it's a great case. When a Democrat is president, there are some areas in New York that a Democrat is going to want to target. New York City being the biggest one, obviously, but places like Albany, places like Buffalo, the city of Buffalo would be another that Democrats would really want to focus on. And of course, probably also some of the larger college towns as well. Syracuse, for instance, Binghamton, another one. When a Republican is president, it's not to say that New York is under a national popular vote system. That's not to say that Republicans don't care because New York City and Buffalo are there. They're just going to care about different parts of the state. And so that can benefit states that are not swing states now. It can benefit blue states. It can benefit red states too. A state like Texas, which is probably going to be a swing state this year, and you're going to see for the first time real presidential campaign dollars being spent there in a way that we haven't in the past. A state like that benefits from either party being in power in the White House. So for example, let's rewind to 2008 when Texas was not a swing state. If under a national popular vote system, the Obama campaign is going to target Dallas, it's going to target Houston, it's going to target Austin, Waco, and a few other areas as well within the state, El Paso for sure. And Republicans are going to target exurbs in rural areas within Texas under a national popular vote system. The McCain campaign would do that. But what happened in 2008? There was no presidential campaign spending happening in that state. And so what it does is it changes the way that presidents would politicize that money, but it increases the opportunity for a state like yours to see money no matter who is president, with a few exceptions, obviously. You have some states that just by their relative size or whatever is probably going to be focused more Republican money versus Democratic money. But broadly, you're going to have more of an opportunity to cash in off politicized fund distribution than you would otherwise.
And I think also, the zero-sum nature of the current system allows for pretty much across the board improvement. So I think that the stark nature of just campaign spending, when you see the time and resources being spent almost exclusively, 95, 96% in 12 states, I think that to the extent that it gets redistributed, it might not be a perfect redistribution, but it'll be a lot closer than it is now. I think people assume that even the bluest states or the reddest states are a little bit bluer or redder than they are. California has 39 million people. 40% of the people who voted here voted for Donald Trump in 2016. So, knowing that Donald Trump is someone who I think has proven over and over again, he's very attuned to his voters and his base. I would think those are people that he wants to pay attention to. But the current system just disincentivizes him from doing so so effectively, because there's just no way that they can help him. Does anyone have any inkling of an opinion that if he campaigned in New York, his home state, that he would have done better than he did? So I just think that it again, the zero sum, either voters matter and I want to go get those votes and they're gettable, or they're not gettable and therefore I'm just not even going to bother allows for such a huge amount of improvement across the board. Because even areas that aren't big or medium-sized cities, if you look at the way states are run, take Maryland. Larry Hogan is not governor because he overwhelmingly carried Baltimore. Maryland's a pretty rural state outside of that. There are all kinds of interests that would incentivize someone like Larry Hogan to make sure he's paying attention to them. Same thing with Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. Boston's not the only place in Massachusetts, and Charlie Baker's not winning that. So I think it just levels the playing field in a way that, not to be trite, but every vote is equal. If you want to say that a little more negatively, there's nothing particularly magical about one vote or another. When you take that sort of gamesmanship out of it, it just purifies isn't the right word. There's nothing pure about it, but it removes the incentive to gamify it.
And again, to pick up on your point on New York, Scott, if President Trump campaigned more in New York in 2016, yeah, maybe he would have picked up a few more percentage points of the vote. But he wasn't going to pick up 24 percentage points
Right.
in the vote, right? And so this first past the post system at the state level is really problematic for that exactly. Now, in a different world, maybe picking up 3% more of the vote in New York does matter to President Trump or candidate Romney or candidate McCain. But given that system, there's just no point in campaigning in New York. In the same way for Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, there was no point in campaigning in Alabama. It was
Right.
just a waste of money. It's just burning money that could help you elsewhere. But in a system like that, you're going to want to campaign in Jackson, Mississippi if you're a Democrat.
Right.
You're not going to campaign statewide in Mississippi, but you're going to pour a ton of money into Mississippi if the popular vote actually matters nationwide.
Yeah, I think I always say to legislators, and I say, close your eyes. Imagine you're a presidential candidate this year. If I'm a genie that pops out of the bottle and I'm offering you an additional 50,000 votes out of Mississippi or an additional 5 votes out of Florida, which would you take? And they sort of get that every time, that those 5 voters in Florida could be determinative. The 50,000 in Mississippi, if you're a Republican, you don't need them. If you're a Democrat, they can't help you. And that alone, the minute you can demonstrate a disparity of value in a person's vote, you hit the nail on the head on the problem. So I think I always say, Dr. Hudak, when we talk about the way campaigns spend their time or resources, those are symptoms of the deeper disease. We're not doing this because we think everyone has a right to a presidential campaign in their backyard, or we think everyone ought to see more political commercials, or campaigns should have to spend all their money in different areas. The real insidious effect of the winner take all system is the incredibly dysmorphic effect that it has on policy. So to watch federal spending get so badly morphed by the electoral needs of the sitting administration is perverse. And I think your average voter understands that implicitly, to the extent that they know what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, you can't campaign on, hey, you'll see more campaign ads.
Yeah.
If we switch to this system, national popular vote would never go anywhere if it meant more mailers and more TV ads. But your point about policy is 100% accurate.
One thing that you mentioned that I want to pick up on, that specifically, if we'd had a national popular vote in 2008, and we would see the Democratic candidate going to some of the places that you mentioned, but that's not dissimilar than what happens now within swing states, right? I mean, candidates don't disproportionately go just to the metropolitan areas, Democratic candidates, and our Republican candidates don't just go to rural areas, right? So Scott, National Popular Vote has done a good bit of research on this. So can you elaborate on that just a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you take a state like Iowa, because it's a nice square state that's cut almost perfectly evenly into 4 different congressional districts, it is astounding how consistently presidential campaigns spend their time roughly equally in each of those 4 quadrants or those 4 congressional districts of Iowa. If you go over to neighboring, or if you go over to Ohio, Ohio is another great example. You know, this idea that you just go hang out in the big population centers, I think is based on this idea that cities are bigger and maybe in some sense more blue than they are. But presidential campaigns in Ohio don't just go to Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus. They're going to places like Lima, Ohio, and places where the population's 5,000 and less, because within the state of Ohio, every vote matters. And at a certain point, you hit a point of diminishing returns where, sure, you could spend all of your time in Columbus, but you're going to be getting less and less and less and less for the time and resources that you spend there. So campaigns go everywhere. And that ends up being true of any election where every vote matters. If you're a state legislator, you're going to go to every door, even if you're not going to get every door. You're going to mail everywhere. You're going to call everywhere. What you're not going to do is block out literally 2/3 of your district and just say, I either want it or I can't win it. I'm going to ignore it. You're going to go to the places where you can maximize your voter turnout. You're going to try not to get killed everywhere that you're underwater, and you're going to fight it out for everything in between. This idea that again, going back to the example of Charlie Baker in Massachusetts or Larry Hogan in Maryland, or look at Florida. I mean, Florida's got a lot of big cities. Ron DeSantis is not becoming the governor of Florida. Rick Scott's not becoming a U.S. senator from Florida because he's overwhelmingly carrying these large cities. If large cities controlled everything, Baltimore would surely elect a Democratic governor in Maryland. So I think it's based on this sort of misconception that the cities are big enough. If you really break down the American population, 1/6 of the country lives in what would be called a census-designated urban area. And that tends to be about 2/3 Democrat in terms of the vote breakout. If you're about 1/6 of the population lives in what the census would call a rural area. 2/3 and that's 60-40 Republican. 2/3 of the country lives in the suburbs and exurbs, and that is 50-50. And that's what governors' races look like. They are aware of those dynamics, and that drives their campaign. And that's really how a national election gets run, like one big governor's race. You're certainly not going to get there by camping out in big cities, nor are you going to get there by just hopping around all the rural areas. You kind of have to go everywhere.
Yeah, and to that point, another great example of that is Nevada. A Republican doesn't get elected statewide in Nevada by only campaigning in rural areas. A Republican gets elected statewide by narrowing their margin of loss in Clark County, where Las Vegas is located, the state's population center. And so the focus still has to be on Clark County as a Republican, not to win it necessarily, but just to lose it by less. Yeah. And that's critically true. And the same with a Democrat. Technically, a Democrat could win statewide, and Democrats have won statewide by just carrying Clark County by an overwhelming margin. But built into that also is by narrowing their loss in rural counties and either tying or coming out a little ahead in Washoe County, where Reno is located. And so when you look at it, it's a matter of balancing. It's not a matter of ignoring everyone else. Right. It's winning big where you're strong and losing by less where you're weaker.
And I think, Eileen, when it gets to things like participation, I mean, the National Association of Secretaries of State did a study, I think it's probably a little bit old now, in 2010, but into non-participation. The number one reason people give for not voting is my vote doesn't count. I mean, so what better way to show people that their vote doesn't count than to conduct a national election in 6 states? And particularly when you have young people, there's a state legislator in Virginia named Schuyler Van Valkenburg, who's a high school civics teacher. And he said, I think all the time about students and getting them to understand how important it is to vote. Well, how do you show them that it's important to vote if you have the main event in a 4-year period entirely passing over them? And so I think that's an important point, in that if you do want an election that engages everyone no matter where they're from, even if that drives up turnout on the other side. And I think that is a really, really important factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I like to bring up when talking about young people is, the people that are voting for the first time by age. So the 18 to 22-year-olds who this is their first presidential election that they're eligible to vote in, they've spent more than a majority of their life under a president that was not originally elected by the majority of voters. So I think that really makes them think, why would I turn out for that? This system it hasn't worked for more than half my life in a way that makes sense. Great. So moving on to some of the questions that we have from our audience. So just as a reminder, we are talking to John Hudak, the Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institute. We are discussing his book, Presidential Pork: White House Influence Over the Distribution of Federal Grants, which is available on the Brookings Institute website if anyone wants to check it out. And we're talking to Scott Drexel, a Senior Advisor to National Popular Vote. So one of the questions that I have here, are the number of swing states changing over time?
So the states that are swing states certainly changes over time. As I said earlier, Texas is going to be a swing state this year. Arizona is going to be a swing state this year. Joe Biden might not win either of those states, but they're tempting enough and the polling is such that he's going to have to put money into those states. With regard to whether there's more or fewer, that's tougher. When you have elections like the one in 2008, where one candidate won by a very significant margin, especially by modern presidential standards or presidential electoral standards since 1992, that certainly pushes a few states outside of that swing state range. It also draws other states in that maybe were artificially a swing state, right? So after 2008, by my measure, Missouri and Indiana were swing states. President Obama won Indiana in 2008. He narrowly lost Missouri in 2008. When we look at Indiana and Missouri now, even despite the fact that the sitting vice president is from Indiana, those are not swing states. And so when we look at the landscape, I think the number tends to hover around a fairly decent equilibrium, 6 to 8 to 10 in that range, 6 states really being like the super swing states and then others in the periphery of that. And like I said, some come in, some go out. After an election like 2016, which was so very close in a lot of states, again, you're going to have some artificial swing states coming out of that. Places where Hillary Clinton probably lost by a narrower margin than an average Democrat would lose to an average Republican, or vice versa, where a state like Utah, which wouldn't qualify as a swing state, but President Trump did terribly in Utah by Republican standards simply because there was a third-party candidate who racked up an enormous amount of the vote there, as third-party candidates do, and took them largely away from Trump. So you have these moments where states, like I said, fold in and fold out. But I think there's generally a core number, even if who those states are changes. There tends to be a core number over time.
I will say that as you go through a presidential election, the number of swing states gets fewer and fewer and fewer over the course of that presidential year. What we're seeing now is a little bit odd in that the battleground is completely shifted because we've had these macro events that I don't think many people could have predicted 12, 18 months ago. But one of the things that happens is as you get into the summer and fall months of a presidential campaign is the resources that a campaign has raised are getting thinner and thinner, and they have to sort of determine where they're going to prioritize those. So there's one point in 2012 where the Obama campaign sort of head faked and made a big reservation in the state of Pennsylvania, even though they were far enough ahead that they really didn't need it, and ended up inducing the Romney campaign to spend a lot of money in Pennsylvania when the Obama campaign's internal polling had them way, way, way ahead. So I think a lot of it comes down to, okay, we're getting down to the end here, and you're getting a little bit clearer picture of what states are actually winnable, what states maybe you're far enough ahead that you don't have to to spend resources there, and what states you might still have a chance to kind of snag in a perfect scenario.
Yeah, you see the Biden campaign, for instance, starting ad buys or making ad reservations, or both in some cases, in Arizona and Texas. That's smart given the polling, particularly in Arizona. That's smart given the current polling. 2 months from now, President Trump could be way ahead in Arizona again, and significantly enough ahead in Texas, where the Biden campaign says, you know what, we're not going to try to expand the map into new Democratic states. We're going to try the old Obama states, particularly the 2012 Obama states, and just withdraw from there. And so you're right that this does change over time. One of my favorites is in 2004, a random poll came out that showed President Bush ahead of John Kerry. John Kerry ahead of President Bush by only a few points in Ohio. And Dick Cheney took a trip not in Ohio, in Hawaii. In Hawaii, this poll came out. And so Dick Cheney had a really nice trip to Hawaii in the middle of October, September or October of 2004, on the off chance that poll was right. Now, of course, it was completely off. And maybe the vice president just wanted a little beach vacation in Waikiki. But the poll changed something for at least a couple of days in that campaign. And those changes can go in either direction.
When it comes to 2020, at this point in time, you've mentioned Texas and Arizona, but do either of you think that there are other swing states that might come out that we aren't typically used to hearing about?
This has shifted from, I'm sort of mixing a little bit of the Senate races in here as well, because I think you do have some of that's being fueled by very competitive down ballot races. What's clear today is Arizona, North Carolina being a very big one. Kansas is an interesting one. I mean, I could realistically see Kansas getting close. I don't know if it could ever get quite close enough that it could be really competitive on the presidential side. But I think if you have a really competitive Senate general election, and the right or wrong, depending on how you look at it, nominee emerge from that Republican Senate primary, that can affect things. But by and large, I think the 6 states that we're hearing about most frequently are going to make up the core: Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Michigan. Texas and Georgia. The thing I always say about both Texas and Georgia, the kind of states for Democrats at least, if you won it, you probably didn't need it to get over that 270 mark. So I think it really has a lot bigger implications for what's happening further down the ballot.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. If Biden wins Texas and Georgia, he's winning in a landslide. You're probably talking about a popular vote margin of 6-7% on the order of magnitude of the Obama 2008 win for that to work. The one caveat, and I agree with everything else in terms of which states that Scott said, the one caveat I think is there could be a perfect storm in Georgia. If Stacey Abrams were to be the vice presidential nominee, I think that could help. And then combining that with what happens with the COVID pandemic in that state, with that state's governor, given how close he is to President Trump, if Georgia really becomes a disaster and the governor is held to account for it, that will hurt the president. It's often, I think, underappreciated how much a statewide elected official can have coattails or reverse coattails. So for instance, I think part of the reason why the Biden campaign is polling as well as it's polling in Arizona is because Mark Kelly, the Senate candidate, has coattails, and Joe Biden, the presidential nominee, is riding the Senate candidate's coattails.
Absolutely.
It's not often that happens, but it does happen, and it happens with enough regularity that I think there's a general level of confidence among people who work in this space that that's happening at least to some extent in Arizona. The reverse coattails can happen too, where a candidate a governor or a senator could really hurt a presidential candidate. There's the capacity for that to happen in Georgia. Georgia is certainly not there yet, And I would be stunned if Biden won Georgia, but I don't think it's so far beyond a possibility that it should be discounted.
I think you're seeing that now in North Carolina. I think
Yes.
Tom Tillis's numbers are so tenuous that I have to think if Tom Tillis's numbers were better, Biden wouldn't be doing as well as he is in North Carolina. Arizona is really
Roy Cooper's doing well.
Same. And I think Arizona is really the perfect example because, number one, you have an astronaut and husband of somewhat of a beloved figure in Arizona who is running a really good campaign against a woman who was appointed to a seat that she lost 2 years ago and is really underwater. But I think in this entire thing, the pandemic, the racial justice and social justice demonstrations have really changed things in a way that none of us could have predicted. And it really has made kind of the way I think of battleground status is imagine a sink with a drain in the middle. States are getting sucked into battleground status. So the lower and lower the president's numbers get, more states that you would typically imagine being solidly red getting pulled in closer and closer and closer to that battleground status. The question is whether they ever get there enough that it makes sense for Joe Biden to divert resources from the states that he absolutely needs to win in order to go after what can kind of be looked at as vanity wins. There are a lot of people who are very nervous about going after a place like Texas. It makes them feel better that there are state legislative races that are competitive. It makes them feel better that there's potentially an outside chance that they could win that U.S. Senate seat. But in order to put money into Texas, you're going to pull it away from something else. And do we want to make the same mistake that maybe Hillary Clinton made in not shoring up the places that we needed to win in Wisconsin and Michigan and places like that before going after that kind of next rung on the ladder and missing the one that's right in front of your face?
Yeah.
Great. And as a reminder, that's where Scott, being a Democratic consultant to National Popular Vote, comes in. Excellent. So thank you both so much. I'm going to take the last question here, which is just about how National Popular Vote works for our closing. So our organization that I work for, National Popular Vote, is a nonprofit, and we advocate for the state-based reform to the Electoral College. So under our bill, the presidency is guaranteed to whoever gets the most votes in all 50 states and DC. We change state law, these statewide winner-take-all laws that we mentioned are a big part of this problem. And we change those laws to that the electors from those respective states go to the national popular vote winner. And the way that this is structured is that the bill only goes into effect when enough states across the country have signed on and have a total of 270 electoral votes at a minimum, which is the number you need to win the Electoral College. So far, 15 states plus DC, for a total of 196 electoral votes, have signed on. So it is, absolutely the opinion of National Popular Vote. This is the way to go. This is what we've been advocating for 15 years. It's a way to make one person, one vote for presidential elections a reality. And I certainly hope if you enjoyed this presentation and you think, yeah, this is an issue I want to get behind, and this is something that I think is unjust or unfair the way it is, and this is a way we could fix it that's really simple. Make presidential elections be won the same way as almost every other race in the entire country. I would invite you to get involved with our organization. You can go to nationalpopularvote.com/volunteer to sign up to get involved with your state. I work with volunteers all across the country in over a dozen states where they're working on lobbying for this bill in their state legislatures, and we really can't do it without you, because as much as Scott and I like talking to legislators want to hear from you, their citizens, their constituents, about how important this issue is. So I invite everyone listening to get involved, and I just want to thank you both so much, Scott and Dr. Hudak, for joining me today, and really just for this excellent book, which is so helpful to the work that we're doing.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.